The help should wait outside until the real decision-makers arrive. The sentence landed in the executive conference room like it belonged there, polished and confident, wrapped in the kind of certainty that came from never being questioned. At exactly 8:12 on a rainy Tuesday morning in Midtown Manhattan, 6 executives from one of the largest consulting firms in America sat around a 40-foot walnut conference table preparing for what they believed would be the biggest contract presentation of their careers. The room overlooked the city from the 52nd floor. Glass walls reflected gray clouds. Fresh coffee steamed from silver carafes. Everything looked expensive. Everything felt important. And standing near the coffee station was a black man in a charcoal suit that was elegant without being flashy, quiet without being forgettable. His name was Marcus Ellington, 44 years old. Calm, observant, unbothered, at least on the surface. He had arrived alone nearly 20 minutes earlier, carrying nothing but a leather portfolio and a phone. No assistant, no security, no entourage. That was intentional. Marcus had spent years discovering what people revealed when they thought no one important was watching. Richard Coleman, a senior executive with silver hair and a reputation for arrogance, glanced toward Marcus and pointed casually toward the coffee service. "We're still waiting on the client," he said. "Could you make sure everyone has coffee?" A few people laughed. Not loudly, just enough. The kind of laughter that carried an assumption. Marcus looked at him for a moment, then at the coffee cups, then back at Richard. He didn't correct him. He didn't announce who he was. He didn't ask for respect. Instead, he picked up a silver pot and began pouring coffee into empty cups around the table. The executives barely noticed. That was the point. Around the room, conversations continued. Revenue forecasts, bonus projections, vacation homes. One executive joked that the contract was already won before the meeting started. Another bragged about the commission he planned to earn. They spoke freely because they believed the only people present were themselves. Near the end of the table sat Emily Carter, a 30-year-old analyst attending her first executive presentation. Unlike the others, she kept looking at Marcus. Something felt familiar. She couldn't place it. The face. The voice when he quietly thanked someone for moving a chair. The confidence. It didn't match the role everyone had assigned him. Across the room, Richard accepted a fresh cup and smirked. "See," he said. "Now that's service." More laughter followed. Marcus handed over the cup without a word. His expression never changed. But somewhere beneath that calm exterior, an old memory stirred. Different building. Different city. Same assumption. Same look. The rain tapped softly against the windows 52 stories above Manhattan, while the executives continued talking as if the most important person in the room hadn't already arrived. And Marcus Ellington, standing silently among them, let every word sink in. The meeting was scheduled to begin at 8:30 sharp, but by 8:22 the executives had already convinced themselves they controlled the outcome. Confidence moved through the room like electricity. Charts glowed on large screens. Financial projections filled slide decks. Expensive watches flashed beneath the conference lights every time someone gestured across the table. Marcus remained near the side of the room, setting down the last coffee cup without drawing attention to himself. Nobody thanked him. Nobody asked his name. Richard Coleman leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "Once this contract is signed, we are going to dominate the market for the next decade," he announced. Several heads nodded immediately. Nobody challenged him. Nobody questioned whether the client might have expectations beyond revenue forecasts and polished presentations. Emily Carter watched the exchange quietly. The more she studied Marcus, the more uncomfortable she became. There was something unusual about the way he carried himself. He was not standing like staff. He was not waiting for instructions. He looked completely at ease in a room filled with people who believed they outranked everyone around them. That detail stayed with her. Across the table, another executive glanced toward Marcus. "Can you take these folders to the back?" he asked casually, sliding a stack of presentation materials toward him. Marcus looked at the folders for a second before picking them up. "Of course," he replied. His voice was calm, controlled. The executive barely looked up from his laptop. To him, the interaction was already forgotten. Marcus placed the folders exactly where requested and returned to his position near the windows overlooking Manhattan. Rain continued tracing thin lines across the glass. 52 floors below, yellow taxis crawled through morning traffic. The city looked small from up here. Emily finally stood and walked toward him. "Excuse me," she said carefully. "Have we met before?" Marcus smiled slightly. "I do not believe so." "You look familiar," she admitted. "Maybe I have seen you somewhere." Marcus glanced toward the conference table. "Perhaps." Before she could continue, Richard called from across the room. "Emily, we need you over here." She hesitated, then returned to her seat. The moment passed, but her curiosity did not. Back at the table, the conversation shifted. The executives were no longer discussing strategy. They were discussing people, competitors, clients, hiring decisions, assumptions, judgments. The type of comments people shared only when they believed the room was private. One executive laughed about appearances determining credibility. Another joked that success always had a certain look. Several people chuckled. Marcus listened. Every word landed exactly where he expected it to. He had spent years hearing polished versions of the same assumptions. Different industries, different cities, same message underneath. By 8:27, phones began buzzing around the room. The client delegation would arrive in minutes. Excitement grew instantly. Jackets were adjusted. Ties straightened. Smiles appeared. Suddenly, everyone wanted to make the perfect impression. Richard stood and pointed toward the hallway. Then he looked directly at Marcus. "We are about to start. You should probably clear out before the important people get here." A few executives laughed again. Marcus simply checked the time on his phone. 8:28. Then he slipped the device back into his pocket and smiled. The important people, he thought, had already arrived. The conference room settled into a strange rhythm after Richard's comment. Nobody asked Marcus to leave immediately. Instead, they treated him as if he had already become part of the furniture. Present but invisible. Useful but unimportant. The giant digital clock on the wall clicked to 8:29. 1 minute before the scheduled arrival of the client delegation. Yet the executives seemed far more interested in themselves than in the people they were about to meet. Richard stood near the head of the table reviewing his opening remarks. "Remember," he said, adjusting his cufflinks, "clients buy confidence. They want to know they are dealing with winners." Several people nodded. Another executive laughed. "Especially billion-dollar clients. They expect a certain image." The room responded with knowing smiles. Marcus remained beside the window, listening. Every sentence felt familiar. He had heard variations of them throughout his career. Sometimes spoken quietly. Sometimes hidden behind corporate language. Sometimes delivered openly, like now. A younger executive named Grant pointed toward an empty coffee cup. "Could you grab another refill?" he asked Marcus without looking up from his presentation slides. Marcus picked up the cup. Of course. Grant never thanked him. He was too busy rehearsing the speech he planned to give once the client arrived. Emily noticed the exchange immediately. Her discomfort deepened. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. She watched Marcus walk calmly to the coffee station and return with a fresh cup. No frustration. No embarrassment. Just patience. The kind of patience that came from knowing something everyone else did not. Back at the table, the conversation drifted further. One executive joked about rejecting a candidate because he did not fit the culture. Another described how success was often obvious within the first 5 seconds of meeting someone. "You can usually tell who belongs in the room," Richard said confidently. "It is instinct." Marcus glanced toward him. Richard never noticed. Emily did. The silence between those two men seemed heavier than the rest of the room. Then Grant looked toward Marcus again. "Actually, before the clients arrive, could you help move those presentation binders?" Marcus carried the binders from one side of the conference room to the other. The executives continued speaking as though he were not standing 3 feet away. Their guard was completely down now. Their assumptions had become certainty, and certainty made people careless. Emily finally opened her laptop and searched Marcus's face online. She felt slightly ridiculous doing it, yet the feeling would not leave her. Within seconds, hundreds of images appeared. Magazine covers, interviews, business conferences, fortune rankings, Forbes profiles. Her eyes widened, then widened again. She looked up from the screen toward the man standing by the window, then back at the photographs. The same face, the same calm expression, the same name. Marcus Ellington, founder, chief executive officer, billionaire investor. Emily's heart began racing. She looked around the room. Nobody else knew. Nobody else had bothered to look. Richard was still rehearsing his remarks. Grant was still making jokes. The others were still congratulating themselves before the meeting had even started. Outside, rain continued sliding down the glass. Inside, the room was seconds away from discovering that the person they had mistaken for staff was the very person holding the future of the deal in his hands. Emily felt the air leave her lungs as she stared at the search results on her screen. The photographs were undeniable. The man standing quietly near the windows was not support staff. He was not an assistant. He was not there to refill coffee cups or move binders. He was Marcus Ellington, one of the most respected business leaders in the country, the founder of a company whose investments stretched across industries worth billions of dollars. Emily looked around the room again. Nobody else seemed aware of what was happening. Richard was still rehearsing his opening remarks. Grant was checking financial projections. Another executive was fixing his tie while studying his reflection in the dark glass of the presentation screen. They were preparing to impress a man they had already spent the morning dismissing. Emily swallowed hard and stood from her chair. Her instincts told her to say something immediately, to stop the train before it reached the cliff. She walked toward Marcus carefully. "Mr. Ellington?" she asked quietly. Marcus turned toward her. His expression remained calm. "Yes." Emily lowered her voice. "I know who you are." For the first time all morning, a faint smile appeared. Not a triumphant smile. Not a surprised smile. Just recognition. "I thought you might," he replied. Emily glanced nervously toward the conference table. "They do not know." Marcus followed her gaze. "No," he said. "They do not." The answer carried no anger, no bitterness. Somehow that made the situation feel even heavier. Emily hesitated. "Should I tell them?" Marcus looked through the glass wall toward the rain falling over Manhattan. Would they have listened earlier? Emily did not answer because she already knew the truth. Back at the table, Richard raised his voice. "Emily, where are those updated client profiles?" She returned to her seat slowly, her mind racing. Every comment she had heard during the last 20 minutes replayed itself in perfect detail. The jokes, the assumptions, the confidence, the certainty that they could identify importance simply by looking at someone. Suddenly, each remark sounded worse than before. Across the room, Grant pointed toward Marcus again. "Can you close those window shades? The glare is hitting the screen." Marcus walked over and adjusted the shades without complaint. The executives continued talking. Emily could barely believe what she was watching. It felt like standing in a theater where only one person had seen the ending. The digital clock shifted to 8:32, 2 minutes behind schedule. The client delegation still had not arrived. Phones began lighting up around the table with incoming messages. Richard checked his device and frowned slightly. "Interesting," he muttered. "The lead client is running a few minutes late." Marcus checked his own phone at the exact same moment. A message appeared on the screen. 3 simple words. "They are ready." He read it once and slipped the phone back into his pocket. Emily noticed. Her pulse quickened. Something was about to happen. She could feel it. Around the conference table, the executives remained completely unaware. They believed they were waiting for the most important person in the deal to arrive. None of them realized he had been standing in the room since 8:10 that morning, listening to every word. The room felt smaller now, though nothing had physically changed. The rain still tapped against the glass. The city still stretched for miles beyond the windows. The conference table still gleamed beneath the lights. Yet something invisible had shifted. Emily carried the weight of a truth no one else possessed, and every passing second made it heavier. Richard checked his watch and frowned again. 5 minutes late, he said. "That is unusual." Grant shrugged. "When you are spending billions, you can be late." A few people laughed. Marcus remained near the window, calm as ever. Then Richard glanced across the room and pointed toward him. "Actually, before they arrive, could you step outside for a few minutes?" The room grew quiet. "Excuse me?" Marcus asked politely. Richard smiled, but there was no warmth behind it. "This discussion is going to involve confidential information. Executive-level material. Nothing personal." Grant smirked. "It is above your pay grade anyway." Several executives chuckled. Emily felt her stomach drop. There it was. The moment she had feared. The line that crossed beyond assumption and into something deeper. Marcus said nothing immediately. His gaze drifted toward the rain streaking down the glass. For a brief moment, another memory surfaced. 22 years earlier. Newark. A conference center 3 states away. Marcus was 22 years old, wearing the only suit he could afford. He had arrived early for an investor networking event after driving nearly 4 hours through the night. He still remembered the excitement, the belief that hard work would speak for itself. A man at the registration desk had looked at him, then looked past him. "Delivery entrance is around back," the man had said. Marcus had explained that he was an attendee. The man had laughed. Not loudly, just enough. The same kind of laugh he had heard this morning. Different city, different faces. Same assumption. The memory faded as quickly as it came. Marcus returned his attention to the present. Richard was still waiting for an answer. The entire room was. "If that is what you would like," Marcus replied calmly. Emily almost stood up, almost said something, almost stopped the train before it reached the cliff. But she remained frozen. Across the table, phones suddenly vibrated at nearly the same moment. One executive glanced down, then another, then another. Confused expressions appeared around the room. Richard checked his screen. His confident smile faded slightly. "What is it?" Grant asked. Richard stared at the message. "The client delegation has arrived." "Good," Grant said. "Where are they?" Richard looked up from the phone. For the first time all morning, uncertainty entered his voice. That is the strange part. Around the table, executives exchanged puzzled glances. The message was identical on every device. Client delegation on site. Awaiting final authorization from Marcus Ellington. The room went silent. Not the comfortable silence of preparation. The sharp silence that arrives 1 second before everything changes. Marcus checked his own phone. Another message had appeared. 3 words. "We are downstairs." He slipped the phone into his pocket and looked toward the conference room doors. Somewhere beyond them, elevators were rising toward the 52nd floor. No one spoke for several seconds. The silence stretched across the conference room like a wire pulled too tight. Richard stared at his phone, then at Marcus, then back at the message. The color slowly drained from his face. Around the table, other executives began checking their screens again as if the words might somehow change. They did not. Awaiting final authorization from Marcus Ellington. The name sat there in plain sight. The same name that had been standing 10 feet away all morning. Grant forced a nervous laugh. There must be some mistake. Nobody joined him. Emily lowered her eyes briefly. She had hoped someone would figure it out before this moment arrived. Instead, they had walked directly into it. Marcus remained calm. He did not rush to explain anything. He did not demand attention. He simply stood near the window while the room tried to reconcile 2 completely different versions of reality. One executive quietly opened a browser and searched the name. Within seconds, his expression changed. Then another executive did the same. Then another. The realization moved around the table 1 person at a time. Like falling dominoes. Richard finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Ellington." The title appeared suddenly, as though it had existed all along. Marcus looked toward him. "Yes." Richard shifted uncomfortably. "I was not aware that you were." His voice trailed off. Marcus finished the sentence for him. "The client." Nobody answered. Because everybody knew the answer. Grant leaned forward. "Why did you not tell us?" Marcus studied him for a moment. Nobody asked. The words landed softly. Somehow that made them hit harder. Rain continued tapping against the windows. The city remained hidden behind gray clouds. Inside the room, confidence had disappeared completely. Another phone vibrated. Then another. Fresh messages appeared. Client delegation arriving on floor 52. Estimated arrival, 2 minutes. Richard looked toward the conference room doors, then back at Marcus. Every calculation inside his head seemed to be changing at once. The presentation he had rehearsed no longer mattered. The jokes no longer seemed funny. The assumptions no longer felt safe. Marcus checked his phone one final time. A message from his chief of staff appeared. "The board is ready. Your call." Marcus typed a short response. "Give them 2 more minutes." Then he placed the phone back into his pocket. Emily watched carefully. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Nobody touched the presentation slides anymore. Nobody discussed forecasts or revenue targets. Nobody spoke about confidence. The only thing left in the room was uncertainty. Richard attempted another smile. It looked painful. "I think we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Marcus met his gaze. His expression remained composed. "Perhaps." The elevator indicator outside the conference room flashed. 50, 51, 52. A soft chime echoed through the hallway beyond the glass doors. Several executives instinctively straightened their jackets. Others adjusted their ties. But this time it was different. They were not preparing to impress someone important. They were preparing to face the consequences of what they had already revealed when they believed no one important was listening. The conference room doors opened slowly, and every head turned at once. Four people entered first: senior advisors, legal counsel, members of Marcus's executive team. They moved with quiet confidence, carrying tablets and folders, their attention focused on only one person in the room. Not Richard, not Grant, not the executives sitting around the walnut table. Marcus. The atmosphere changed instantly. One by one, the newcomers greeted him. "Good morning, Marcus. Everything is ready. The board has approved the final documents." Each sentence landed like a weight on the room. Richard stood frozen. Grant looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. Emily watched silently as reality finally caught up with everyone else. Then another group entered. The client delegation. The people the executives had spent weeks trying to impress. Men and women responsible for one of the largest contracts in the industry. Their leader, a respected executive named Catherine Brooks, walked directly past the conference table without stopping. She crossed the room and extended her hand to Marcus. "Thank you for your patience," she said. "We have been waiting for your approval to move forward." Marcus shook her hand. "I appreciate you coming." Catherine smiled. "There is no one else we would rather do business with." Around the table, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The silence felt enormous. Richard glanced toward the presentation slides he had prepared. Suddenly, they looked meaningless. Marcus stepped away from the window and walked toward the head of the table. The same seat that had remained empty all morning. The seat everyone assumed belonged to someone important. He placed his portfolio on the table and sat down. Nobody questioned it. Nobody dared. Across from him, Catherine and her team took their seats. Marcus looked around the room carefully. His gaze settled on Richard first, then Grant, then the others. "Interesting morning," he said calmly. Nobody answered. Marcus folded his hands. "When I arrived today, I wanted to learn something." Richard lowered his eyes. Marcus continued. "I wanted to see how people behaved when they believed power was not watching." The room remained silent. Every word felt precise, deliberate. "You asked me to pour coffee." Marcus looked toward Grant. "You asked me to carry binders." Then toward Richard. "And you told me this discussion was above my pay grade." Nobody laughed now. The conference room felt completely different from the room that existed 30 minutes earlier. Marcus leaned back slightly. "You called me support staff before learning my name." Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Ellington, I would like to apologize." Marcus raised a hand gently. Not angry, not dramatic, simply stopping the interruption. "The problem is not that you mistook me for staff." His voice remained calm. "The problem is how you treated someone you believed was staff." The words settled over the room like a final verdict. Across the table, Catherine nodded slowly. Several members of her delegation exchanged knowing looks. They had seen enough. Marcus glanced toward the contract resting beside him, then back at the executives. "This agreement is the largest opportunity your firm has ever received." He paused, just long enough. And all morning, the people responsible for earning it were busy revealing exactly who they are. Nobody rushed to speak. Nobody reached for the polished explanations that had seemed so easy an hour earlier. The conference room had become a mirror, and every person sitting around the table was staring at a reflection they did not like. Richard finally leaned forward. "Mr. Ellington, I want to sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding." Marcus listened without interrupting. Richard continued. "Had we known who you were, things would have been different." The moment the words left his mouth, several executives nodded in agreement. Marcus lowered his eyes briefly, then looked back up. "That is exactly the problem." The room went silent again. "If your respect depends on knowing someone's title, then it is not respect." His voice never rose. It did not need to. "You keep calling this a misunderstanding, but I understood the situation perfectly. The question is whether you do." Catherine Brooks folded her hands and watched quietly. So did the members of her delegation. They were not interested in presentations anymore. They were watching leadership. Real leadership. The kind that revealed itself under pressure. Grant shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "We made assumptions," he admitted. Marcus nodded. "You did." Grant looked down. There was nothing else to say. Marcus opened his portfolio and removed a thin folder. Inside were notes. Not financial notes. Not market analysis. Observations. Throughout the morning, he had documented everything. The comments. The behavior. The culture revealed when executives believed no one important was paying attention. He placed the folder on the table. The numbers in your proposal are strong, he said. Your market strategy is solid. Your projections are impressive. Several executives looked hopeful for the first time in minutes. Then Marcus continued. But contracts of this size are not built on spreadsheets alone. They are built on trust. The hope disappeared. Rain continued sliding down the windows behind him. The city remained hidden beneath gray skies. Inside the room, every person seemed to be waiting for a verdict. Marcus looked toward Catherine. Would you trust leaders who judge people before learning their names? Catherine answered immediately. No. The response landed with the force of certainty. Marcus nodded. Neither would I. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Across the table, nobody argued. Nobody defended what had happened. The evidence was sitting in front of them. Marcus stood and slowly walked around the conference table. Not as a conqueror. Not as someone seeking revenge. Simply as a leader making a decision. He stopped beside Emily's chair. There was one person in this room who chose curiosity over assumption. Emily looked surprised. I did not do much, she said quietly. Marcus smiled. Sometimes doing the right thing begins with noticing what everyone else ignores. Then he returned to the head of the table. This contract will move forward, he said. Several executives exhaled with relief. Too early. Marcus raised a hand gently. But not with the current negotiation team. Relief vanished instantly. Effective immediately, I am requesting a new leadership group for this project. People who understand that character matters before credentials. People who know that respect is not reserved for the powerful. Nobody protested. Nobody could. The decision had already been made. And for the first time all morning, the room finally understood that the real evaluation had never been the presentation. It had been them. For a long moment, nobody moved. The storm that had filled the conference room all morning was over. What remained was clarity. Marcus returned to his seat at the head of the table and opened the final contract. The pages rested quietly beneath the conference lights. No dramatic speeches. No celebration. Just a decision waiting to be made. Catherine Brooks reviewed the final terms one last time before sliding the document across the table. Everything is in order, she said. Marcus nodded. Around him, members of both leadership teams watched in silence. Richard and the others remained seated, no longer the center of the room. Their presentations, rehearsals, and assumptions had faded into the background. The lesson had already been delivered. Marcus signed the final page with a smooth stroke of his pen. The contract that would shape billions of dollars in future business was officially approved. Catherine smiled and extended her hand. We are proud to partner with you. Marcus shook her hand firmly. Likewise. For the first time that morning, the room relaxed. Not because the deal was finished, but because the truth no longer needed to hide. Rain continued falling outside, but the clouds were beginning to break apart. Thin bands of sunlight pushed through the gray skyline and reflected against the glass walls. Emily noticed it immediately. The city looked different now. Or maybe the people inside the room did. Marcus gathered his papers and stood. Several executives from the client delegation approached to congratulate him. Others discussed next steps for the partnership. Yet before leaving, Marcus turned back toward the conference table one final time. Every eye followed him. His voice remained calm, measured. The same voice they had heard all morning without truly listening to. 20 years ago, I thought success would protect me from assumptions. The room grew still. Then I learned something important. Success does not erase prejudice. Titles do not erase assumptions. Wealth does not erase judgment. Nobody interrupted. What changes things is character. Character is how you treat people when you think they have nothing to offer you. Richard lowered his gaze. Grant did the same. Marcus was not speaking to embarrass them. That was obvious now. He was speaking because the lesson mattered. This morning, some people saw a man holding a coffee pot and decided they understood his value. He paused briefly. That was their mistake. The room remained silent. Marcus looked toward Emily. And some people chose curiosity before judgment. Those people build stronger companies. Emily felt her face warm slightly. Then Marcus looked around the conference room one final time. Never assume you know someone's story because of what they are wearing, where they are standing, or what role you think they play. By the time you discover who they truly are, the opportunity to show respect may already be gone. Nobody spoke after that. They did not need to. The message hung in the air long after Marcus walked toward the doors. As they closed behind him, sunlight finally broke through the clouds over Manhattan. And for everyone left inside that room, one truth remained impossible to ignore. He never raised his voice. He raised the standard.